It was with solemnity and sadness that the facts led to criminal referrals for the former president of the United States. But I'm proud of the work that our committee has done, and I think that people ask me, how do we make sure January 6th never happens again? And I think that there are a number of things we need to do, but probably among the very most important, and maybe the most important, is we have to hold those who were responsible for January 6th accountable.
That was outgoing Republican Representative Lynn Cheney of Wyoming, one of the two Republicans on the House January 6th committee, which was selected by the outgoing Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, speaking on Wednesday about the committee's final report. Cheney lost her seat this past November, with her membership on the committee being the primary issue in her campaign. Today we begin by taking a look at what the committee actually was and is, and what the final referral to the Attorney General actually means. Beginning with a conversation with Attorney Dan Kovalik. He's an American human rights, labor rights lawyer, and peace activist, and teaches international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. We spoke with him via Skype from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on Wednesday. Dan, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate having you. It's good to see you, too.
You too, Don, as always.
So, starting with the committee itself, this was actually not the first attempt on behalf of Nancy Pelosi to examine the events of January 6th, which they likened to an event on the same scale as September 11th, and attempted to have what they called a September 11th type commission. That attempt failed in the Congress when more than 40 senators blocked it, so they could not overcome the filibuster. They then turned around and set up a committee, which Pelosi was able to do pretty much on her own. She selected 5 Democrats and 2 Republicans, the 2 Republicans being anti-Trump Republicans, vehement ones like Lynn Cheney, and presto changeo, it's time for a criminal referral against Trump. You're well known as an international lawyer who looks at particularly election integrity and issues around that. And there's some issues here, aren't there?
It appears that there was a large amount of dissent, certainly within the Senate and in the House as well, over all of this, and that it's not as, quite unanimous as we're being led to believe. I think that there will be a lot of concern if this prosecution goes forward, because obviously it's intended. I think all of these moves against Trump, whatever you think about Trump, are designed to prevent him from being able to run in 2024, which I think the government should, be very slow to make moves like that. I mean, I think when you're talking about someone who, again, whether you like Trump or not, who has a certain amount of popularity amongst the population, in the end, unless there's an overriding evidence and concern, really you should let the people decide whether they care enough about that to elect him or not elect him, right? And, I have to say, while I don't view him in the same way as I do people like Lula or Castillo in Peru, the truth is, when you look at those cases, popular leaders were prosecuted for the same reason, to keep them out of office, right?
Right.
And those of us on the left have been concerned about that, as because we see this as tantamount to coup d'etats in those countries. And of course, we have an affinity with those leftist leaders. But I think one also has to, try to be a bit dispassionate about whether they like a particular candidate or not in Trump, for example, and question whether Congress should act to prevent someone from running for office. I think that should only be done in the most egregious circumstances. And honestly, I'm not sure if those are present here.
It's an interesting thing. When I was watching the litigation after the 2020 election, there were some serious issues that were raised, particularly over and they were coming at fundamental constitutional issues. There were wholesale changes made to election law, particularly in the states, the so-called battleground states that were decisive, that enabled lots and lots, millions of people to vote remotely through a variety of mechanisms. And that was enabled not through the usual process of the state legislature enacting, the changes to the law. And as a matter of fact, it was done in the face of the state legislature, for example, in Pennsylvania, rejecting it twice, but rather through administrative or executive means, the governor, executive order, the attorney general with an interpretive ruling that permitted it, and such. And the question being that the Constitution calls for the election procedure in federal elections, particularly for president, to be determined by the state legislature. So this was litigated. And in most of the cases, as a matter of fact, the lawsuits were dismissed on threshold issues. In other words, you filed too early, you filed too late, you filed in the wrong venue, the wrong party sued, etc. One or two cases, they actually got to try the merits, and the courts said, listen, if we make a finding on this question, it may change the outcome of the election, and we do not believe it is the role of the judiciary to overrule the voters. But that's exactly what the Congress is trying to do here.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is what they're trying to do. And, Trump, I think, is an interesting figure because he's so polarizing and obviously represented some kind of a threat to the ruling class, not just amongst Democrats, but Republicans as well, right? That doesn't make him a good guy. But again, he was a popular choice in 2016. I think he clearly won. I don't think there was truly Russian interference, which helped him win, but that was made up to justify the loss that the Democrats had and couldn't otherwise explain, or they weren't willing to explain the truth of the matter, which was they turned their back on the working class, which they, labeled deplorables and therefore lost their base, but they weren't willing to own up to that, right?
Right.
And even in 2020, again, I think Trump, lost that. But at the same time, he got millions and millions of votes. I mean, he still got I think like the second highest vote count in U.S. history, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
When you take those things into account, again, a Democratic government has to be tread very carefully on then trying to disqualify someone like that from office, because you really are disenfranchising millions of people who might vote for him.
Right.
And it's been done before. Obviously, in the case of Nixon, was forced to resign, lost his political career because of real corruption. At the same time, I think if we were honest, we might come to the conclusion that a lot of presidents could probably be disqualified on similar grounds. I mean, Nixon's big sin, what he was really covering up is his lies and his secret war in Indochina, right, where he was secretly bombing Cambodia and Laos for a long time, trying to keep that secret from the American public. That's really what Watergate stemmed from and everything. Mm. Well, every U.S. president, certainly since World War II, is guilty of similar crimes. So I think you're looking at a little bit of selective justice here, when it comes to Trump. And again, I didn't vote for Trump, not once. But at the same time, I think one should be very reluctant to take him out of the electoral process, given where the will of the people is at.
Dan, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Don.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.